Good morning, everyone. Welcome to Tech Tuesday, hosted by the IET Toronto Local Network. Today's Tech Tuesday is a really interesting theme on societal and environmental changes to do with food and water. And with that, I'm going to launch straight into the presentation.
Thank you very much for the invitation to speak here today. I'm going to try and pick up on some of the themes the other speakers have mentioned, particularly focusing on the implications of climate change for food and water, and taking an international perspective, and also looking here at home in the UK. So to begin with, I think this slide from Sir John Beddington's speech in 2009, in which he coined the phrase perfect storm, really sets the scene for what I want to discuss nicely, in that he looked purely at the implications of the growing world population, and by 2030, projections were suggesting a 50% increase in the demand for food, and a 50% increase in the demand for energy, a 30% increase in the need for water, all driven by population growth. Superimposed on top of that, the challenges of climate change that are coming in the next few decades. And so this led to a number of questions that were raised about how can we equitably, sustainably feed, provide water for, provide energy for this growing population in the face of climate change. At the same time, trying to adapt to the climate change that we're likely to see, that Nigel's alluded to, and mitigate climate change, try to avoid further dangerous climate change, try to store more carbon in the land system in particular, with the finite area of productive land that we have. And as Raghav was really mentioning as well, these intersectoral pressures, interdependencies are very important here. We have a finite amount of land and water resource with which to provide food, provide water, and also use some of that land to provide things like biofuel energy. And can we do all of that at the same time while trying to avoid negative impacts on the broader environment, things like biodiversity and ecosystem change? So I'll just give a bit more detail, if you like, some brief examples at the global scale of future climate impacts towards the end of the century from a recent project we were involved in called the Human Dynamics of Climate Change. And I'll give some examples across a range of impacts. So whilst river runoff is projected to increase globally on average, quite a mixed picture in terms of areas seeing increases in annual average runoff, such as Northern Europe, and decreases in southern parts of Europe because of the warming climates, changing rainfall variability, the need for irrigation water for many of the crops all over the world is projected to increase. Crop yields again see quite a mixed picture depending on the region, depending on the crop. Maize yields projected to decline in many world regions. On the other hand, in northern parts of Europe, winter wheat yields could increase with declining wheat yields in the south of Europe. The warming climate, changing rainfall variability could lead to increases in the number of days spent in droughts in many parts of the world. And similarly, we could see increases in flood frequency, as the other speakers have alluded to over many world regions. Some areas might see decreases, though, depending on the changing rainfall pattern, and also in the cold regions, things like the changing snow regime. Smaller snowpacks during the winter will lead to snower melt peaks feeding into the rivers in the springtime. Coastal flooding, a big threat because there's both the combination of rising sea levels alongside the growing populations in large cities around the coast, leading to millions of people being additionally put at risk from coastal flooding. And as Nigel mentioned, because temperatures are projected to rise all over the world, that's likely to lead to increases in the very warm days, with knock-on impacts through heat waves on human health and heat stress for animals. And finally, marine ecosystems are projected to be threatened by both warmer sea surface temperatures and acidification. Those global and international changes, if you like, though, are really important for us here in the UK. It's not just about what happens in the UK. As pointed out by the International Dimensions of Climate Change report produced for the Government Office for Science, 40% of the food that we eat in the UK is imported from overseas. The proportion is rising, And so therefore, we're highly vulnerable, certainly in terms of food supply, in terms of the price, security and availability of food into the UK, in terms of what's happening in regions overseas. And so in the future, in the coming decades, we will be affected indirectly through climate impacts on things like floods, droughts, changes in pest and disease, how they affect food production in overseas regions. And there will be broad-ranging impacts, things like supply chain issues and market issues. Moving closer to home, Nigel's covered some of this. The latest climate projections that we have for the UK are the UK climate projections, known as UKCP 09, produced in 2009. They broadly paint a picture of hotter, drier summers and warmer, wetter winters for many parts of the UK. But in the recent past, as has already been mentioned, we've seen some quite different events and different seasons to that, really, that have gone in the opposite direction. The cold winter of 2010, the cold spring of 2013, and the wet summer of 2011, all quite different to hotter, drier summers and warmer, wetter winters. Partly the reason for that is because these headline messages from UKCP are long-term averages over a 30-year period, so they smooth some of that variability out. But there are also other reasons for this as well, as Nigel mentioned, related to climate variability and current climate variability. Looking then at the UKCP projections and trying to understand what they mean for particularly extreme seasons, if we look out to 2100, we see indeed that the risk of experiencing very hot summers, very dry summers, or very wet winters increases quite considerably. 6- or 8-fold, even 20-fold increases for the hot summers there, which is broadly in line with the headline messages. But because of the underlying natural variability of climate that we still have in the present day, and the time it takes for the climate signal to overcome that, if you like, there's still a finite risk, something like a 1 in 3 risk of seeing a wet summer or a cold winter until the 2020s, 2030s, 2040s. So we need to be aware and remain aware of the current variability of climate and how climate change interacts with it. What will these changes in climate in the long term mean for agriculture and food production in the UK out to the 2050s? The climate change risk assessment that was performed for the UK suggests increasing yields for many of the major crops in the UK, but the calculations don't look at things like the implications of heat and drought stress, which could be particularly important, and also there are strong regional differences. So in southern parts of the UK, where it could be hotter and drier, winter wheat yields might decline or even increase by a smaller amount, but increase by a bigger amount further north and into Scotland. As has already been mentioned, the implications of flooding for agricultural land could be quite substantial, potential doubling under some scenarios of the current area of good quality agricultural land that's flooded every 3 years. In line with the global projections, largely suggestions for increases in irrigation demands in England and Wales, and the impacts of heat stress could have a finite impact on milk production in the UK. How can farmers adapt to these changes, try to make the best of any positive opportunities and avoid the negative ones? There are a range of potential measures, largely to do with agricultural management here, things like changing the sowing dates, changing water management practices, changing the kinds of species they make use of in grasslands, more water efficient species, changing the cycling, the seasonality of livestock systems, and other things like tree planting to provide shading, windbreaks and so on. So there are a number of things that farmers can do. But as well as these long-term average changes, as Nigel's mentioned, it's really unusual seasons and extreme events that are particularly important for food and water resources, not just the long-term averages. And to illustrate this, really, 2012 summer was very wet, the wettest on record at the time for 100 years, and had quite substantial impacts on wheat production because of the wet conditions in the UK and on insurance costs. At the other end of the spectrum, the very hot, dry summer in 2003, which was the hottest such event for hundreds of years, had quite significant impacts on major river flows in Europe, even affecting electricity generation through hydropower. And we might consider, according to the projections, that a 2003 heat wave would be at the relatively cool end, at the normal end of the spectrum, a normal summer by the 2040s, and even cool by the time we get later into the century, to the 2080s. Finally, really looking to the more specific extreme events, I think heavy rainfall, as we've seen today, is one that has particularly important impacts. The UKCP projections largely suggested increases in very heavy rainfall events during the winter time. New research from the Met Office using a very high resolution climate forecast model, which is capable of getting the very heavy rainfall events right and representing the convective rainstorms that lead to them, has suggested that not just in the winter but also in the summer we might be exposed to more very heavy rainfall events, very short run hourly rainfall events with knock-on impacts for things like flash flooding, transport of agricultural goods and other transport issues, environmental impacts like soil erosion and nutrient losses and so on. So to conclude, I think really hopefully illustrated that climate change and its variability, linking to the points Nigel made, could have substantial, significant impacts on a wide range of food and water resources. If we're looking at the global and international picture, there are quite strong regional differences. Some areas could see positive impacts, some could see negative, depending on what we're looking at. There's lots of uncertainty across the different scenarios we have, the different climate models, the different impact models, all of which can be used in a risk management framework, as has been mentioned by the other speakers. The implications globally and nationally are quite broad-ranging and don't just cover things like physical and biological impacts, but also broader issues like supply chains, trade and economical issues. And I think, as the other speakers have really mentioned, it's the impacts of extremes that are particularly important, particularly concerning, and have a wide-ranging set of associated impacts. And finally, linking to what Raghav was saying, I also think the interdependencies, the relationships between impacts in the future will be a really important part of the picture to adapt to. Thank you.
If you did enjoy this video, please do subscribe to stay up to date with our events and videos. And of course, don't forget that we do have a presence on the engineering communities. And if you pop across and check out the IET Toronto local network page, you'll be able to see what we've got coming up, like our Mill Street Brewery Tour in 2016 AGM coming up on the 17th of September, as well as join in some of our discussions and find out what else is going on in our local network. Thanks, and we look forward to seeing you at our next Tech Tuesday.